Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us to our second of 5 urban lunches in the lead up to the visit of Alain Bertaud in mid-September. Alain started his career working for none other than the god of high modernism, Le Corbusier. Now, how do you top a career that starts that way? He was designing Chandigarh, the capital of Punjab. Since that time, I'd say it's a very good start. Since that time, he has traveled the world to the most exotic places. Okay. Unfortunately, is everything good? Okay. So since that time, he's traveled to exotic places, and he was the chief urban planner of the World Bank. He was the author of Order Without Design. And the goal that he has in that is to link together urban planners and urban economists so that they work more closely together. Okay. Now, when I read the book, Order Without Design, I gained so many insights, and I really do recommend that, that you should take a look at the book. I've learned about thinking about cities, these insights, thinking of cities as a labor market, how markets shape cities, how transportation can be a real estate issue. Now, we're having 5 urban lunches in the lead up to the visit by Alain Bertaud. He's coming in mid-September. His first meeting will be with all of the heads of the planning departments of Metro Vancouver. And then the second meeting will be giving workshop to members of the Vancouver Planning Department. And then it goes from there with media and all sorts of other things we've planned for him. So the first lunch, we had Jens von Bergmann and Nathanael Lauster. And we had an incredible treat, a buffet of data visualization. And I urge you, we recorded that, and we'd love you to look at the kind of information they provided. Today, we have 2 remarkable people, both of them teaching at SCARP, at the School for Community and Regional Planning at UBC. Erick Villagomez, who is the editor-in-chief of Spacing Vancouver, has offered to have Spacing Vancouver be a repository for a lot of the presentations that you're going to hear over the next 4 urban lunches and the previous one. So now we have a very special thank you to our other special guest, Julia Harten, who is a professor at SCARP, but she is, if you'll hear any seabirds or any waves that you can hear lapping at the beach, she's somewhere in Greece in a very remote place about to get married. And she is so committed to being here and her work that she is here joining us. Maybe the connection is not as good, but we're so excited to have her here, and we are, I know everybody will join me in congratulating her on this happy news. And I just wanted to acknowledge there are some people here. I just did a quick look over. I'm probably missing a lot of people. Dan Huang, who is the president of the Canadian Institute of Planners. We have Maged Senbel, who is a professor at SCARP and a colleague of both Eric and Julia. We've got board members from the Global Civic Policy Society, Wayne Hartrick, Daniel Toe, and Jeff Moore. My colleague at SALA, where I teach occasionally with Patrick Condon, he's on board. Patrick and I disagree about almost everything except that we love Vancouver and we love each other. So we're so great to have him here. And I'll be mentioning a few other people as we go through. Oh, I would like to just specially acknowledge Gordon Price, price tags. I still call it price tags, but now call it Viewpoint Vancouver, a real go-to place for urbanists. He's got a tremendous podcast that he does as well. And I'd like to also list Amy Nugent from Urbanarium, which is a fantastic organization that is really a go-to as well. So let's just jump in. I'd like to, first of all, I'd like to also acknowledge Devin Harlos, who is on our organizing committee, and she is a member of Planning Institute of BC, and she organized that anybody who attends Alain Bertaud's event on September 20th at the Playhouse Theatre will get 1.5 professional credits, and also anybody who attends today's. If you're a member of the Planning Institute of BC, you can apply for 1 credit by attending today's event. So Devin also, I'll just say, she is the one who makes these incredible artistic streetscapes of Vancouver. So if you're a real urbanist and you're so focused, you can actually get one of her maps that are beautiful pieces of art. Okay, now I'm going to turn this over to Sebastian, and we're grateful for Sebastian Zane, who worked for one of the icons of Vancouver, Phil Bonham, Urbanics, and he was the head of Marathon Realty in the 1970s, and since that time has been involved in almost every major piece of Vancouver history development. So please, Sebastian, come on down and be the moderator for today's presentation.
Thank you, Sam, and thanks to all of you in the audience for such a great turnout again. I know.
Can't you hear you, Sebastian, a little bit higher?
Oh no. Okay. Is this good now? Okay, excellent. What we strive to do here is to elevate the lunchtime experience from the usual tab backlog or social media scroll. I know the first session was excellent, and I'm very excited to see where this one goes. So joining us today, we have Erick Villagomez. He wears many hats, knitting together the urban fabric of Vancouver. He teaches at SCARP and Kwantlen. And in 2017, he self-published a book, The Laws of Settlements, focusing on the creation, extinction, and spatial patterns of cities. And as Sam mentioned, he runs Spacing Vancouver. Julia Harten is a relatively new arrival to Vancouver. We're very excited to have her in town, adding to the conversation. And her recent PhD dissertation won an award for combining some nifty data strategies with some ethnography to do an in-depth study of Shanghai's housing market, which we're going to hear more about. So Erick and Julia are going to build on our last conversation with their many areas of expertise. And at the end, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. So please put your questions in the chat or send them to me directly if you wish to remain private. It's quite late where Julia is right now, so she's going to get this kicked off. Over to you, Julia.
Just 1 second, Sebastian, I forgot one person that I notice is in the audience, none other than Alain Bertaud himself. He came to our last one, and here he is again. You are amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. Carry on.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that welcome and the introduction. Let me share my screen. I prepared some slides. So does everyone see my cover page? Yes, okay. I see some nodding in the few boxes that I can see by the side of my screen. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here, well, not physically, but we have all learned over the past couple of months that we can give talks and get together from many places and still have meaningful conversations. So I hope today is going to be good like that too. I'm as has been said, I'm a recent addition to the SCARP. I started right in the middle of the pandemic last year, and well, today I'm still remote, but have come to love Vancouver in the few months that I've lived there so far. Today I'm going to talk about some of my PhD research, my doctoral research, an issue or phenomenon that I call hidden informality. And let me just, think this is the way it goes. I guess many of you have the question, what do I mean by hidden informality? What is this? And before I go into explaining what I mean by hidden informality, let me just give you a flavor of my research to illustrate my point. So what you see here is a picture I took during fieldwork in the summer of 2016 in Shanghai, China. And this is, you know, a high-rise building and a gated community, a very typical sort of piece of architecture that you can find throughout all of China's bigger cities nowadays. And everything looks pretty neat, right? Neatly manicured landscape, nice cars, nice high-rise building. But it isn't until you open some of the doors that you realize actually in some of these units, there's many more people living there than what is allowed, right? There's building codes, there's land use regulation, and some of these units actually house many more people than what is allowed. So that's actually what I decided to study for my PhD. And in Chinese, this is called a 群租房 or 床位出租, bed space rental. So people rent a bed and share the apartment with many more people, a form of extremely crowded and shared housing. And to further illustrate my point, here's a sketch that I took after I visited one of these places, you know, just a brief outline of the apartment. And you can see here, this is a former 4-bedroom apartment, now housing 50 people. F stands for female, M stands for male. This was a you know, co-ed apartment. And you can see there's beds in the kitchen, living room, basically anywhere where you could put beds. They have put beds and then rented them out individually to people, right? So this is what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to make the case why this is relevant beyond China and Shanghai. So just having looked at this, you could already see that this is different from what we usually think of when we think about informality or informal housing. So it's not informal land ownership, right? It's not squatter settlements. Nobody built their own house illegally. Something that this is a proper, perfectly legally built and zoned high-rise building that I just showed. It's also not an informal construction, right? This is a completely formal structure, formal and regulated environment. So what makes this informal, and that's why I also call it hidden informality, is that it's an informal or illegal use of formal structures. So the formal apartments, they're legally, everything is proper in terms of ownership or leasing if they're rented out to one person. But then what happens after that, right? People try to find space. And in this case, it's this market for bed space rentals where beds are rented out individually that emerged. An informal use of a formal structure, and it can hide this way in the formal built environment. Why should we care? What does this have to do with anyone else that doesn't live in Shanghai, right? What I'm going to try to argue here is that this is actually a shared phenomenon that is shared across the world. So sharing or crowding, this is an extreme form, of course, but in lesser forms, in less intense forms, is happening around the world. So I collected some newspaper clippings here to convince you, perhaps in the little time that I have, that indeed this is happening in other cities, other places. So here is a clipping from New York, where a condo owner converted the 2 condos that he owns into 18 micro units by slicing them vertically and horizontally. Where I did my PhD in LA, I did my PhD at USC. It's also frequently in the news for being one of the epicenters of overcrowded housing in the US. This one is from London, 26 people living in a 3-bedroom apartment. I like this one from Australia. Room sharing is the new flat sharing. And also in Canada, this is overcrowding is a known problem in Canada more broadly, but also in Vancouver specifically, where we have a quite severe housing crisis. Okay, next question. Is this something new that is just happening now? Have we not paid attention all this time? Where does this come from? Actually, when you look back in history, overcrowded housing is something that has occurred in different places, different times, you know, throughout. So here's a picture from the turn of the 20th century, taken in London. This is called rope housing, where actually they just hung ropes across the rooms to let people rest by hanging their bodies over these ropes, right? The extreme crowding, you can see in the picture how many people are resting or sleeping like this. Maybe more of you are familiar with the pictures of the New York tenements, where the newly arriving immigrants to New York were housed again during the turn of the 20th century. And looking back in history, and also taking that global view, already gives you an idea of why this is happening and why China might be an interesting case to study. So what I argue is that China and this shared or overcrowded bed space rental housing that I studied specifically in Shanghai, but which is happening in big cities and growing cities all over China, is actually an illustrative case of something that is a bigger phenomenon that we have, observed, but maybe not conceptualized in the way that I am doing it here. And what I argue is that it's actually a symptom of the particular moment of urbanization that we're in right now. If you remember the pictures that I showed just a minute ago, those are pictures taken during the Industrial Revolution, right? And another intense moment of urbanization. Right now, we are in an urbanization moment where economies are shifting to knowledge economies, where cities, play a more central role. If our economies rely more on knowledge and services, cities are going to be much more important for economic growth, right? So we have that strong urban pull right now as well. And at the same time, and related to that, we live in the bigger cities. In an environment where the built environment is actually intensely regulated and controlled. So it's much more difficult to set up a tent or a little shack in the middle of Shanghai, as you can imagine. But how do you study something that can exist precisely because it's hidden? These people are able to do this because it's happening behind closed door. It's much harder to regulate things that you can't see, right? So in other words, how do I go from this to this? And what I did is, as was mentioned in my introduction, I used a combination of an online data strategy together with traditional ethnographic methods. So what this means specifically is that I started out collecting rental ads. So this is a screenshot from an advertisement for a bed space rental. This is a sort of Chinese version of Craigslist, if you will. And in there you can see there's pictures, there's the price, and it has a pretty rich descriptive text kind of describing the tenants they're looking for, and interestingly also describing different rent levels depending on how many people you share your room with, right? So I was able to collect data in this way. I set up an algorithm to systematically scrape and collect these advertisements over a period of 5 months in 2016 until that name that I was using, or that I was looking for, became blocked. So bed space for rent was no longer supported by that website, and so it was harder to systematically scrape. I scraped over 33,000 ads initially, and after cleaning, I retained about 10% of that data that I'm sure is unique, and that I'm sure is unique, which is, if you look at other papers that work with scrape data, it's roughly comparable. What I did next was actually go and visit some of these places. Initially, I just wanted to see, how does the online world that I kind of had imagined from the data that I collected, how does this compare to the real world when you go actually to visit those places? And for that purpose, I hired some local graduate students that would pose as potential renters, and we would go in teams to kind of inquire about a bed that my friend and me might be interested in renting. And pretty pretty soon it became clear that actually a lot of that information was inaccurate, in the sense that the addresses were not quite right. The prices were always a little higher in reality. There were actually more people than what they describe online, you know, kind of painting a nicer, rosier picture online versus what I found when we actually visited those places. So I actually collected another set of data through that way, you know, hiring students, sending them to apartments and asking all the information that I could also get from the ads to be able to compare one-on-one those different data sources, right? And then a year later, I also went, oh no, 2 years later, I also went to rent a bed myself in one of these places. And this is me with glasses in my bed that I rented for roughly 2 weeks, just to get a get a feeling of what it's like. Of course, it's a completely different experience for me to just stay there for 2 weeks versus people that actually live there for several months or even years. But just to get an understanding of what the day-to-day life is like, and maybe be able to talk to some of the tenants more. And so I did interviews with former, current bed space renters, and all of that. Is not in this talk actually, but can be found in papers that I have started to publish from this work. And I have links to that on my last, or at least the names on the last page of my presentation. Okay, so these are 3 distinct data sources that I draw on for my work that I have published from this. Today, I'm going to talk mainly about the first 2, so more quantitative findings here, just because they're using concepts from urban economics, and so I thought that it is interesting given the context of this event. So just briefly some selected findings. I started by asking myself, okay, what can I learn about who is renting in this market, right? And I looked at the advertisement text. As I showed you in that screenshot, the ads actually have quite rich descriptive text of what landlords are looking for in a renter. So I developed a method to systematically analyze that advertisement text, and found that they frequently mention students, recent graduates, certain keywords that indicate urban young professional as an ideal sort of tenant for these beds. And I also did interviews with landlords and tenants, and again I found that confirmed that indeed a lot of them are recent graduates, but particularly from smaller cities or smaller universities. So not the elite, but sort of the next rank graduates, and an interesting preference for male renters. I wrote a whole separate paper on the gender dynamics in this housing situation, which are quite interesting, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So just looking at that data, you could already see that this is a seller's market, right? The landlords are able to describe pretty detailed what kind of person they're looking for. There's just so much demand that they can be picky and choose who they want to rent the beds for. And then at least myself, I was quite surprised in the beginning when I found those to be the typical renters of the bed space market. Typically recent graduates, college graduates, we don't think of them as being housing poor or struggling to find housing. So just an interesting finding that I think resonates for shared and crowded housing more broadly beyond China. What do they pay for? What can I learn about the trade-offs that renters make from the data that I collected? In short, it's the typical trade-off that we see in urban land markets or housing markets, right? It's space for access to amenities, and access particularly to employment centers. Here is an illustration of that point. So this is a map of Shanghai. Kind of what's within that dotted line is what's considered downtown Shanghai, more the older city of Shanghai, central Shanghai if you want. And here is a zoomed into that downtown area. I mapped some of my observations. So here you could see, oh, there's a glitch in the font I'm just seeing here. The purple dots are the the places that we visited, and the red dots are the places that the advertised addresses for the group rentals. And the only thing I want you to take away from this, and I'm having the same image here, just with the wider selection of all the rental ads that I scraped and the addresses that they contain. The impression that I want you to take away is that of a donut shape, right? There's an area in the middle that is kind of empty, which is the very central Shanghai French concession, for those that are familiar, which is dominated by very high-end retail and office space, luxury villas. So they're not there, but they're just adjacent to that, right? So bed space renting kind of gives you that access, proximity to those employment centers, white collar type employment, that otherwise is unaffordable for this demographic. And I'm going to show that also by looking at some of the pricing information that was in the ads. So here's just a simple frequency table. You can see there's a negative association with the number of people that you share a room with, and then correspondingly how expensive the bed is that you rent. So of course, the more people you share with, the cheaper the bed. Right, and on average, what we found most commonly, people share with 6 or 8 people. It's even numbers because they're bunk beds, right? To stack people even on top of each other, to maximize the use of the space. And then the average rent that I found across all the places that I visited and the online ads is around 150 Canadian dollars per bed per month. For context, at that time, the average income of a migrant worker, so these are obviously people that have come to Shanghai, they don't have family to stay with, is around 1,000 Canadian dollars. So you could say on the one hand, that's an affordable price. On the other hand, of course, the landlord makes a lot of money off of these people. So it's quite exploitative as well. I don't know how we're doing on time. I'm just going to do this very quickly. For those of you that are familiar with hedonic modeling, this is just a simple multivariate regression model. The log price of a bed is the dependent variable, and I'm trying to tease out what are the individual explanatory factors that contribute to that final price that you observe, right? And so we see what urban economics tells us, that as you increase the distance from the CBD central business district, as you increase the distance, the bed gets cheaper. Similarly, as you increase the people per room, the bed gets cheaper, or the people per apartment, the bed gets cheaper, right? You have less space, you have more people to share the space with. And then some apartment level amenities that make sense. You know, if you have more bathrooms to share, that makes the bed more expensive. Or if you're on a lower bunk, that makes the bed more expensive because you also have somewhere to sit conveniently. Otherwise, there's really no other furniture in these places. Okay, this is my very quick rundown of parts of my research, parts of the data that I used. And I hope I convinced you that that's not just a peculiar phenomenon happening in Chinese cities, but it's actually worth looking at because overcrowding, sharing as a coping mechanism to deal with precarious labor market circumstances, to deal with urbanization pressures and rising housing costs. This coping mechanism is actually something that is happening all around the world, and I think is reaching more and more demographics that we haven't been familiar with before. And here's just a couple of papers that talk about this in academic journals.
Thank you, Julia. That's amazing. You are amazing. You're not only doing a research paper and scholarship, but you are getting married at the same time. So
yeah.
Remarkable. I just wanted to butt in a bit because I wanted to thank you. And I know you have to get married, so you're going to be rushing off. But I wanted to acknowledge a couple people. Marie Agnes, the wife of Alain, has also joined us. And we also have Ron Kellett, who is my boss. So it would be very bad for me not to acknowledge the head of the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. Also Andy Yan from the City Program SFU. And then John Fountain from New Zealand has joined us. So thank you so much. So I will hit it back. Thank you so much, and I'll give it back to Sebastian.
Thank you so much, Julia. And as a young person, I definitely have identified many buildings in Vancouver where this is common. As you noted, mostly in the downtown core, people who maybe could live to afford farther away, but they really, really want to be central to here. So they do solariums or dens or 4 beds to a bedroom. Thank you so much. And if anyone has questions for Julia, Eric is also quite familiar with this type of research. So if Julia has to run off, you can still toss questions our way, and Eric will do his best to answer. I forgot that his CV is so long. I forgot one of the most important parts of Eric's urban practice. He runs a very diverse design and architecture practice called Métis Design Build, with a focus on residential design and also some informational design. So with that, Eric, please share some of your fountain of knowledge. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, and thank you, Julia. Fantastic, and all the best in Greece there. So what I'm going to do, again, things were a little bit up in the air in terms of what this would be like. So what I did is prepared something that could be actually it could be probably a semester long, if not 2. Or 5 minutes long, depending on how much time I had. As mentioned, I'm attempting to create a repository through this, which is Miro, which you're seeing right now. That's going to attempt to get everything. We already have. I just uploaded Julia's full presentation right there. We have some of last week's. And this is going to be my little piece. And my piece is going to attempt to stitch a whole bunch of disparate stuff together. And I'm going to do that in a way that is somewhat open-ended, flexible. It's not meant to necessarily have any definitive conclusions, but to open up more questions that were brought up initially by Jens and Nathanael last week, and that continue through this idea of informality. So I'm going to try and stitch stuff together, including some of the comments and discussions that were happening. You're going to see the Grand Bargain is right over here. We're going to see Patrick Condon stuff that's recently been coming out, just as a way to kind of really crack open the door around this issue of densification. It's also going to call upon some of Alain's earlier work, which is right here, and we'll touch upon that in 1 second. So a little bit of the format, because I'm going to share a link so that everyone here can actually visit this. All of these things are hyperlinked. So I'm going to touch upon them quickly, but you could always come back and actually read some of the pieces, some of which are on spacing, some of which are not, that begin to kind of substantiate some of the stuff that I'm going to say. Again, I wanted to leave it open-ended and flexible. At the bottom, there are some quick takeaways in terms of food for thought about all of these things. And I'm going to try and add all the rest of the urban lunches down here and try and organize it in a way that begins to stitch together all of these different things. So let me begin. One of the big things, again, as was said, I have a really big interest in settlements. There's a free copy of that book. I worked hard to get it for free out into the world that you could go via this link. And this is a very rough and crude timeline, and it's made up dominantly of visuals that I've created and that all the linkages between that and the pieces that actually explain what these visuals are about. So there's a rough timeline that goes left to right and kind of up and down. It's kind of weird that way. But for those of you who know me, that's the way my brain works. So I'm going to start out a long time ago, and I'm going to start out with this image that has Vancouver in comparison to other cities and their populations. And right below these images, you're going to see a whole bunch of questions. So again, the idea is about generating more questions and cranking open this issue of diversity or density and affordability. I'm not going to touch a lot upon movement, which is a big part of actually Alain Bertaud's book. But just for reasons of simplifying, I have about 10 minutes to do this. So you're going to notice right here that Vancouver, its footprint relative to all the footprints of these ancient cities circa their different timelines, you're going to notice again, it has the most area relative to that, and one of the least amount of densities. And that brings up a lot of questions around urban pattern, the pattern itself, spatial structure, building type, density, and affordability. Is there a relationship there? And I think that's something worth potentially thinking about. This is going to lead me to the structure of Vancouver proper, right? So this is one of the issues that we're dealing with here. And this started back in the 1800s when the first lines were scraped along this and plotted along this this landscape. And again, it's worth noting, but I'm not going to go into too much depth around how different that was than the First Nations way of viewing the world here, and what the implications of that were. Now, this was touched upon again by Alain in one of his earlier works, 2004, The Spatial Organization of Cities, where he touches upon the relationship between pattern, urban structure, and density distributions, as well as this issue of what I'm going to talk about in terms of equity and social equity, which ties into what Julia wound up discussing. I'm going to layer on top of that this issue that I wrote at length of a multi-part series around Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. And it's not something related specifically to urban form, but the implications of that were really, really interesting. And I'm going to oversimplify this admittedly here, where he kind of equates through all of this research on economics over time, that during something special happened, special in a bad and a good way, happened with the 2 world wars, where a lot of the capital that was locked in a very small percentage of people was automatically redistributed into the wide world. And what wound up happening with that redistribution is interesting, because the first thing that people did as that money flowed into the wider populace was buy land. And boom, the suburbs explode. And that is within the context of a lot of the wealth that this 1% had generated was on land, right? So land was one of the main things that they wound up using to do that. And in return, the first thing that people did with it was buy land as a mode, arguably, of mimicking how these people had gained their wealth to begin with, right? So it brings up a lot of questions around what are the positive attributes of low density landscapes. We're first, right now we're in the mode of bashing them constantly. And as this wonderful book here, among many, would describe, is that there are a lot of implications to that and a lot of positive pieces of the suburban landscape and the issue of what to maintain versus what not to maintain in this idea of densification becomes critical. This is related to how it's happened, and densification has happened across Vancouver. What you're going to wind up noticing here is something a little bit more specific than what Jens and Nathanael touched upon last week. And this falls under what I'm going to call roughly the grand bargain as per Gordon Price's piece that we're going to see down below. And this idea was that there were certain very specific regulations put in place that actually controlled the densification model that the city wound up taking. And you could see this rough density here, and you could see it in more definition now through a lot of the work that was presented last week. So what we're seeing here is something that was mapped onto, I mapped it onto the explosive, what we could see here, Vancouver at the top, along the other cities, that density and affordability actually don't go hand in hand. And there's a lot, again, of people who argue that automatically you become affordable, you need to densify, and automatically the affordability thing handles itself. And in fact, that is not the case. And arguably, this is covered in the grand bargain, which again, you can link to here, which I would propose started not necessarily here up top, but also back here. That's where, to my mind, and Gordon, you might actually go and argue against that, but I would say that it started back at that time, the grand bargain. And what we're seeing here are other pieces. Patrick Condon's most recent piece, I believe that just came out yesterday, around how these densities and how the price mismatch. This was also covered, I believe, in Six City, if I'm not mistaken, Patrick, and you can tell me that, yay or nay, but you mentioned that, I believe, as well in that book. Mark Lee's piece on affordability. So this brings up questions. What inequities are built into our regulations? What hidden bargains are part of our everyday practice? How does what's the relationship between density and affordability, and what are the implications of that mode of governance. Now, within that, I studied again affordability, and I wrote a piece on this, which was based specifically on order without design that we're going to see right here. And within that, Alain gives this wonderfully elegant model that I tried to replicate up here, but simply put, we didn't have the information. We didn't actually gather the information. I actually, I don't know whether Jens remembers this, but I actually, while I was writing this, I was going back and forth with him to try and find the housing consumption per household. And it didn't seem like that anybody, including the City of Vancouver, was collecting that. And consequently, which again speaks to Alain's amazing character, just last week, and earlier this week, I published a piece with his response to my initial piece, and he corrected and wonderfully critiqued it, ripped pieces of it apart, and actually wound up correcting key pieces. And here we see the Vancouver income distribution model, and you could see, of course, where things lie in terms of kind of the median, and where the majority of the current higher density building stock is being built. My argument here is that the majority of our housing, our high density housing, is actually targeted at people that are well above what that kind of median is. And I think, again, that's something to really consider in terms of the accuracy of the picture that we have of affordability, the data we have, what are the biases, some of the standard metrics we use, and what is not quantifiable. And that's going to go quickly into this next 4 little columns here. Some of the things that are kind of weird and wonderful that I love doing. This is a flight pattern of YVR in Vancouver. And what you're going to notice is a few things, is that actually sound affects the distribution of densities. What winds up happening is that you're going to notice that they go over the ALR. And this actually happens in Calgary, where it is in the city. At the 35 decibel meter, residential uses actually occur. So sound is actually affecting where people can build and where they can't build, whether they are within it or not. So how do different senses actually work within that? And there's a current initiative happening right now around smell in Vancouver, trying to figure out smells in and around the city and how that affects people. And again, I would argue that something like that affects density. Speaking about migration and immigration populations, here's a kind of little video that I created that shows the SkyTrain lines and the implications of that on immigration populations that I had up until that time at the 2001 based on census data. And I was part of the academic working group, the chair of that for the Mayor's Task Force on Affordability, where they laid out what the affordability benchmark was. And it was $80,000 per household, to which the entire group wound up saying, how is that an affordable benchmark? But sadly, this is something that's continued until recently. And P. Kondo here also wrote about that slight change that happened recently to go with the median renter's income versus the median household income, which is lower, but arguably not low enough. So the questions become, who are we densifying for? And it's affordable for whom? How is it measured? And what's the relationship between that and potential building type? We can't talk about that without discussing amenities. What you're going to see here is a graphic I created, and again, consequently wrote about the distribution of children across the landscape. And a lot of this was happening at a time when a lot of closures of schools were happening on the east side of Vancouver here in the dark brown, that actually have higher number of kids than those that were being maintained because people were going across borders. So again, what was happening is an inaccurate picture. And you see the distribution of kids here. And you could see, of course, in 2010, the least number of kids live within this area, yet the most number of closures are happening in the area with the least number of kids. So what is the relationship between densification, affordability, and amenities? These packages at the very least go in tandem. Crime. This is a crime map that I created a while ago that showed the distribution of crime in the city. Its relationship to density was not actually very strong, hard and fast, but some things can be inferred. And again, this speaks to some of the negative attributes potentially of densification that we don't really talk about. And this leads to Christopher Chung's amazing piece recently on the 30th that he wrote about shade given the heat wave, and that a lot of the areas that are denser have less trees that are also related to equity and people's income levels. And this was really brought to the fore, I would say, by Sam Bloch's whole series on shade as a civic resource and inequality. To almost end off right here, talk about building type. One of the things that happens that I think is really interesting that we don't recognize because we are stuck into a mode of viewing inequality and densification in a horizontal plane is that we don't recognize that it's happening vertically. Now, this is all anecdotal because all the people, the real estate board wouldn't tell me. So I had to kind of rely on my real estate agent friends to tell me that for every story that something goes up, each unit goes up $10,000 locally. So by the time you reach this story right here up to the sub penthouse, you're already at $350,000 higher than this bottom unit. And again, what we're seeing here is a vertical distribution of inequality, let's call it that, or at the very least, that things are being measured in a very odd way when we are relying on this type of visualization. This speaks, of course, to missing middle issues, and also how to map things like inequality and how to map things that aren't mappable. So this is a little thing on kind of data. So what are the implications of the building types we're discussing? House types, how do they support affordability goals? What's overrepresented, what's underrepresented? And of course, what's the potential informal uses of these things that Julia spoke to, and what is the hidden underbelly? Last but not least, I also wanted to show how it's scalar. So this is the step code that's currently going. And because I work at a residential setting, what winds up happening is that I understand a little bit more than most the implications of what this means on affordability. So as increases of energy requirements, i.e. some of this that's really interesting in this, literally just came out a few days ago, the carbon neutral for Metro Vancouver 2050. Some of these attributes actually trickle down into affordability. So what's happening is that you will have these more stringent energy measures that are in effect increasing the cost of the units. And units, again, that if you're looking at development, gets transferred almost directly to the people buying it. So we have an inherent contradiction, this idea of energy use and carbon emissions, what we want to achieve there, but also a kind of affordability measures. And last but not least, I'm going to go into this because this is one of my favorite things by Russell Ackoff, that amazing formula, much debated, but I think it's pretty bang on, that despite the fact that we love collecting data, it's not going to give you much. Data is lesser than information, it's lesser than knowledge, it's lesser than wisdom. A lot of people believe that you automatically have data, you have a lot of it, and de facto you have wisdom, but I would say that that is not the case. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to leave it at that and let everyone explore this through what I'm going to give you in the chat. And you could go click it, look at it across the board, and I hope to be going and expanding on this further. So thank you. And here, let me put this in here. So here is the link. And there is the password. There it is. You could go and you could click on any one of those. They lead to other written pieces as well as other documents. And again, you can read some of the earlier stuff that was going on last week, that grand bargain, etc.
Fantastic, fantastic, Eric. I always tell you I love you for your mind. It's so broad and you bring in so many elements. I'm going to hand it over to Sebastian, but I just wanted to mention to everybody, next Urban Lunch, August 12th, it will feature Chris Lewis, who is a Squamish counselor. He was one of the founders of Musqueam Tsleil-Waututh Squamish Development Corp. He's very involved in all the developments that they're happening in Vancouver. And also David Negrin, who started with Concord Pacific and went to Aquilina, and now he's running a lot of the Indigenous development projects in the city. So just wanted to give that advertisement. So hope you can all join us. It's going to be fantastic. Sebastian, take off.
Thank you so much, Eric. And just a reminder to everyone, please put your questions in the chat if you have them. I'll kick this off actually on your last point, since you're actually designing homes in Vancouver. Do you have an estimate about how much the new step code has added to residential unit costs, and does it also impact the internal layout that would otherwise be optimized for something like livability or light instead?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it really depends on the scale that you're doing. So it's part of the step code right now, for example. So if you're looking at the interior space, they've moved from a standard that was 2x6 construction at the smaller residential scale to 2x8. So you're automatically taking out square footage within. Now, what's interesting is how you construct that. So there are 2x6 models for walls, but then you'd have to go for things like exterior insulation that again kind of increases cost. So there's no hard and fast rule about how much it's going up. But one of the other variables that's happened, I'd say over the past 8 months or so, is that wood itself, so if you're looking at wood construction, has exploded in cost. It is extremely expensive now. So it's not only the system, but the actual wood resource that is, again, fluctuating, and it always has, but right now it's at a high. So I wouldn't even, like what it might be in a year and a half might be completely different than right now. But so I think at the very least, I was looking, speaking to a friend who is doing a new build currently, so 5 weeks ago. And he said at that point when it wasn't fully framed and it was a standard single family house, he was already in the hole for wood alone close to $100,000, which again is very high for a new build construction. So again, you could kind of see how this is scaling, but it's right now, there's more research needs to be done in terms of the actual numbers.
Thank you for the thorough answer. So tying it all together, if you had one message for regulators at the local or provincial level based on your design experience, what would it be?
Well, I would say that you can't look at these things as separate. I think it's we regulators and policymakers don't put those pieces together. So all of a sudden, we all generally agree that we have to become more energy efficient, but there's no relationship between, hey, that's going to affect the affordability down the line, that you need to start looking at kind of what Graham wrote there, some of the paradoxes in the value systems that we have, because some of them are in direct conflict with one another. And again, I just scratched the surface with some of those because even these issues on equity and stuff that I just kind of touched upon are inherently contradictory to the stuff that we're doing. And all of them have great ideas behind them and good motivations. But the thing is that no one's kind of putting all the pieces together to show how there is friction there. It's not actually a very smooth relationship between all of these.
Right, so you get this kind of web of policies, some of them working at cross purposes, all of them well motivated, but the net effect might not be what they had in mind with
Exactly.
any one policy.
Exactly.
Before we wrap up here, let's have a word from Alan, who's very kindly joined us for the second Urban Lunch. Welcome from New York, Alan.
Oh, I think
the audio doesn't seem to be coming through.
And as he gets this started, I have to, again, no, not yet, Alan, that it is incredible that he went to, and if you look at the piece that links to, he gave a step-by-step method on how he came up with that new graph that took my information and regraphed it in a stronger way. It's incredible. So again, I have to thank you for that.
No luck yet with Alan.
Here to you, Alain.
As we work on that, we have an observation from Patrick Condon that I think he's unmuted.
Is your volume up, Alain? You might have to turn your volume up. Oh, you're a co-host now. Uh-oh. Can't hear you.
So what PC was discussing there,
Yes.
Increased inequality is the driver of unaffordable housing. Just saying, dot. That's a classic Patrick Condon. Nice, succinct, to the point. I know that he knows Piketty's work quite well, and I didn't again go into that quite a bit purposefully, but there is again a very strong idea and support for what I would say what Patrick's sentiments are, because as those developments, as one, for example, starts aggregating lots, those wind up going into single development modes, right? So the developer becomes the main profit making person out of there, which again, you can watch now the Netflix special on capital in the 21st century, there's been an explosion of things going back to the way they were according to Piketty, pre-World Wars, which means that fewer and fewer people are making more and more money, and the rest are going in the opposite direction. So I think, again, something at least to think about.
So maybe we could try one more time. Alain, are you on the bottom left hand of your screen? There's a mute button. That doesn't seem to have done it.
I think, as someone pointed out, you may have to unplug your headphones from the computer.
Or you might have to unplug.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, yay.
Oh. So that's strange because usually it's okay. So thank you so much for inviting me. As usual, last time, I'm very impressed by the presentation. I mean, fantastically interesting, and the way they all link together. If today the first presentation about people who are subdividing existing apartment in Shanghai, but particularly everywhere else, it's a way of adjusting. Basically, poor people outbid the rich by consuming very little. And regulation do not allow them to do that. So they have to do it informally. And by doing it informally, they lose certain rights. They lose, so there is a cost of doing it informally. So that's, it would be interesting to graph, if, on the income curve of Shanghai, to graph the consumption of floor space per income that that was collected there. It was fantastic, and I'm sure that you could find the equivalent in Vancouver, by the way, and it would be very interesting. So if you do not have the complete consumption curve of correspond to income, you could have case studies which are, I think, very, very illustrative of what we are talking about. So thank you again very much. I don't want to hog the line. That was a fantastic, interesting thing. And I'm learning more about Vancouver, which is a good thing for me.
Thank you so much. And we're very excited to have you here in September.
Thank you.
So we're ready to end. We're trying to be very, very rigorous about respecting all of your time. So thank you so much, Sebastian and Alain and Eric and Julia. And we will see you 2 weeks' time. There's going to be Chris Lewis, who is the head of the Squamish. He's also the chair of SFU, where he has been up until recently. And we're going to have a great presentation by him and David Negrin. So please join us in 2 weeks' time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Alain.